It all started with the water. Before her, there was only the pool, a rectangle of impossible blue cut into a sprawling stone patio. My job was to keep it perfect. A chemist of chlorine and pH, a hunter of stray leaves, a priestess tending to a silent, chlorinated god. For 3 weeks, that's all it was. I'd let myself in through the side gate of the Vance residence, a house so modern and severe it looked like it had been carved from a single block of ice, and I wouldn't see a soul. I was a ghost in khaki shorts and a faded t-shirt, paid to maintain an illusion of effortless perfection. The silence was the loudest thing about the place. It was a wealthy, architectural silence, the kind that hummed with the cost of its own emptiness. I imagined the owner, Mrs. Vance, as some severe, older woman who probably wore linen kaftans and drank martinis before noon. I was comfortable with that imagined version of her. It kept a professional wall firmly in place, a wall I desperately needed. I was 22, trying to pay for my last year of art school by skimming debris from the surfaces of other people's lives. The wall was everything. It was the only thing that made me feel like a professional and not just a kid in over her head, trespassing in a world I didn't belong to. Then came the fourth Tuesday. The sun was high and cruel, beating down on the pale limestone until it shimmered. I had the long-handled net in my hands, my movements slow and practiced, tracing lazy figure eights across the surface. The water was so clear it hurt to look at, a window into a sterile blue heaven. I was lost in the rhythm of the work, the scrape of the net, the hum of the pump in the little shed. That's when the glass door slid open. The sound was a soft, expensive sigh, but it ripped through the quiet and snagged on my nerve endings. I froze, my back to the house, and held my breath. It was her. It had to be. I prepared myself for the kaftan, for the polite but firm dismissal. Instead, there was the soft slap of bare feet on hot stone, coming closer. I forced myself to turn, to be the polite, deferential pool girl. "Good morning, Mrs. Vance," I'd say. Everything is running perfectly, the words were queued up, ready to be deployed. But they died on my tongue. She wasn't in a kaftan. She was in a bikini. It wasn't a flashy thing. It was a simple, black, athletic cut, the kind of thing a serious swimmer would wear. But on her, it was arresting. She was older than me, maybe in her early 40s, with a body that spoke of discipline. Strong shoulders, long lines of muscle in her legs, a flat stomach. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe knot, and her face, devoid of makeup, was all sharp angles and intelligent eyes. She wasn't just a homeowner. She was a presence. A force. And she was walking directly toward me, her gaze cool and assessing. My entire world, which for the last hour had consisted of alkalinity levels and the trajectory of a dead beetle, suddenly tilted on its axis. The professional wall didn't just crack, it vaporized. I was just me, Maya, standing there in my sweat-stained shirt, smelling of sunscreen and chlorine, holding a stupidly long net like some kind of pathetic gladiator. She stopped a few feet away, and the silence stretched, thick and heavy with the heat. "You're the new girl," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was low, smoother than I expected, like dark chocolate. It didn't fit the icy house. "Yes, ma'am." "Maya," I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. I felt a blush crawl up my neck, a hot tide of humiliation. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her eyes scanned the pool, the perfect, undisturbed surface. "It looks clean." It was a simple statement of fact, but it felt like a judgment, a test I had somehow passed. "Thank you," I squeaked. She didn't smile. I wasn't sure that face even knew how. She walked to the edge of the pool, dropped her towel onto a sleek lounge chair, and without a single moment of hesitation, dove in. The entry was flawless, a clean, sharp slice into the blue that left barely a ripple. I stood there, net in hand, watching her dark shape move with powerful, rhythmic strokes from one end to the other. She was a machine. Efficient, beautiful, and completely self-contained. I felt a pang of something I couldn't name. It was more than just attraction. It was a profound sense of loneliness, both hers and my own, reflected in that perfect, empty water. I realized I was staring and quickly turned back to my work, my hands trembling slightly. The job was no longer simple. The water was no longer just water. It was her space, and I was an intruder who had suddenly, terrifyingly, become visible. The silence that returned was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of her, cutting through the water, breathing. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my gut, that nothing about this place, or me, would ever be simple again. That first encounter set the rhythm for the next 2 months. Every Tuesday I'd arrive, my stomach in a low, anxious knot. And every Tuesday she would be there. She never spoke to me again after that first day, not really. There would be a nod of acknowledgement, a cool, unreadable glance, and then she would dive into the water. Her name, I learned from the paperwork my boss had given me, was Eleanor Vance. I started calling her Eleanor in my head. Mrs. Vance felt too formal for the woman who swam with such ferocious grace, whose bare shoulders glistened in the sun. Saying her name to myself felt like a small, secret rebellion. I became an expert on the cartography of her routine. She would swim exactly 40 laps, her form never faltering. Then she would haul herself out of the water in one fluid motion, water sheeting off her toned body, and lie on the chaise lounge. She'd put on sunglasses, open a book, always a thick, serious-looking hardcover, and remain perfectly still for an hour. During this time, I would do my work on the far side of the pool, moving with a quiet reverence, as if in a library. I learned the smell of her sunscreen, a clean, expensive scent of coconut, and something faintly floral that would hang in the humid air. I learned the way a single drop of water would cling to the sharp curve of her collarbone before tracing a path downward. I learned that the knot in her hair would sometimes come loose, and she would impatiently, almost angrily, twist it back into place without looking. These were my secrets. Tiny, stolen observations I collected like precious stones. They felt dangerous. I was building a person out of these fragments, a person far more intimate than the silent, imposing woman who paid my company's invoice. My work became a meditation, a ritual. The act of cleaning her pool felt like an act of devotion. I wanted the water to be perfect for her. I skimmed with a surgeon's precision. I scrubbed the tiles until they gleamed. I balanced the chemicals with an alchemist's care. It was the only way I could communicate, the only way I could give something back to this woman who unknowingly dominated my thoughts. My internal monologue was a constant argument. She's your client. This is unprofessional. Stop looking. But I couldn't. Watching her was like watching a storm contained in a human body. There was so much power, so much control, but underneath it, I sensed a deep, churning unrest. It was in the rigid set of her jaw as she read, the fierce precision of her swimming, as if she were trying to outrun something. One Tuesday, I saw a crack in the facade. She was on the phone, her voice low but sharp. I was hidden by the pump shed, checking the pressure gauge, and couldn't help but overhear. "I don't care what he thinks is fair, Sandra," she hissed into the phone. The agreement was clear. "This house is mine." There was a pause. "No, he is not welcome here." "Not ever." She snapped the phone shut and stood with her back to me, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her whole body was rigid with a tension that seemed to vibrate in the air around her. She stood like that for a full minute, staring at the unblinking blue of the water. Then, she took a deep, shuddering breath, and the tension seemed to drain out of her, leaving her looking smaller, slighter. She turned, and for a split second, her eyes met mine through the foliage around the shed. There was no anger in them. Just a flash of raw, unguarded pain. It was so brief I might have imagined it, but it struck me like a physical blow. In that moment, she wasn't the formidable Eleanor Vance. She was just a woman, standing alone in a house that was supposed to be a dream, a house that had clearly become a battleground. She held my gaze for a heartbeat longer than was comfortable, her expression unreadable, and then she turned and walked back inside, the glass door sliding shut behind her with a soft, final click. I finished my work, my hands unsteady. The perfect blue of the pool suddenly looked cold and lonely. The wall between us, the one I thought was made of professionalism and class difference, was more fragile than I knew. It was made of silence. And it had just begun to crumble. The storm broke the following week. Not just the one inside me, but a real, honest-to-God summer squall. The sky had been a bruised purple all morning, the air thick and heavy, promising violence. I was trying to work faster than usual, hoping to get the cover on the pool and be gone before the heavens opened up. The wind was already picking up, scattering leaves across the pristine surface as fast as I could skim them. It was a losing battle. I was wrestling with the heavy solar cover, the wind catching it like a sail and nearly pulling me in when the glass door slid open. It was Eleanor. She was wearing gray sweatpants and a simple white t-shirt, her hair in a messy bun. She looked softer, less formidable, without her usual poolside armor. "You need a hand with that," she stated, her voice raised to be heard over the rising wind. Before I could protest, to insist on my professional competence, she was there on the other side of the pool, grabbing a corner of the massive blue cover. "On three," she commanded, and I just nodded, my hair whipping across my face. We worked together, a strange, silent team against the elements. The wind howled, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the hot stone. We fought the cover into place, our movements synchronized, our hands occasionally brushing against the coarse fabric between us. It was in one of those moments, as we both reached to anchor a corner, that it happened. Her hand covered mine. It was unintentional, a simple accident in our shared struggle. But her skin was warm, her grip surprisingly strong. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. It felt less like a touch and more like a circuit being completed. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned, my heart hammering against my ribs. We finally got the last anchor latched just as the downpour began in earnest. We were both soaked in seconds, rainwater plastering our clothes to our skin. I couldn't stop staring at her hand, the one that had touched mine. She was looking at me, too, her dark eyes unreadable in the gray light. The rain washed away all pretense. We were just two women, standing in a storm, breathing hard. The smell of ozone and wet earth filled the air. "Thank you," I said, the words feeling ridiculously inadequate. "You'll catch a cold," she replied, her voice low. She didn't move. Her gaze dropped from my eyes to my mouth and lingered there for a fraction of a second too long. The world seemed to slow down, the roar of the rain fading to a distant hum. In that moment, the space between us was charged with a new kind of energy, something far more dangerous than the storm raging around us. It was a question hanging there unspoken. A possibility. I saw her throat work as she swallowed. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the moment was gone. She blinked, breaking the spell, and a mask of cool composure slipped back into place. "There's tea," she said abruptly, turning toward the house. "You should come in and dry off before you leave." It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, softened by an edge of something I couldn't quite decipher. Concern? Or something else? I stood frozen for a moment, the rain dripping from my hair into my eyes, watching her walk away. The professional wall was a ruin. The storm had washed it all away, and I had no idea what, if anything, I was supposed to build in its place. Following her inside felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. But staying out in the rain, alone, felt even more impossible. I took a breath and followed her into the house. The inside of the house was just as I'd imagined, minimalist, elegant, and achingly empty. It was less a home and more a gallery, curated for a life that wasn't actually being lived there. She led me not to the grand living area, but to a smaller, cozier kitchen at the back of the house. She handed me a thick, fluffy towel that smelled of lavender and pointed toward a small bathroom. "Dry off as best you can," she said, her back already to me as she filled an electric kettle. The gesture was so unexpectedly domestic it threw me off balance. I dried my hair and face, my reflection in the mirror a mess of damp curls and wide, startled eyes. When I came back out, 2 mugs were sitting on a butcher block island. The kitchen was the only room I'd seen that felt warm, that felt used. There were cookbooks on a shelf, a splash of what looked like wine on the white backsplash, a half-eaten apple on the counter. It was a room where a person actually lived, not just existed. She pushed a mug toward me. It was filled with steaming Earl Grey tea. "Thank you," I said again, wrapping my cold hands around the warm ceramic. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the drumming of the rain against the large picture window that overlooked the now turbulent pool. "You're studying art, aren't you?" she asked, her voice quiet. I was so startled by the personal question that I nearly dropped my mug. "How did you?" "Your boss mentioned it when he recommended you," she said, taking a sip of her tea. "Said you were his most meticulous employee. An artist's eye, he called it." I felt that blush creeping up my neck again. "I'm a painter. Mostly. Or, I'm trying to be. What do you paint?" She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed, her gaze genuinely curious. The power dynamic felt different in here. We weren't client and contractor. We were just two people, trapped by a storm, drinking tea. Landscapes, mostly, I admitted. But not pretty ones. I like the ones with crooked trees and weird light. The imperfect stuff. A small, sad smile touched her lips. It was the first time I'd ever seen her smile, and it transformed her face, softening the sharp angles. "The imperfect stuff is always more interesting," she said, her eyes drifting to the window. "People spend so much time and money trying to build perfect lives, perfect houses." Her gaze swept around her own perfect kitchen, and her smile vanished. "They think it will protect them. But it doesn't. It just becomes a very beautiful, very expensive cage." The confession hung in the air between us, raw and vulnerable. She had just handed me a piece of her story, a piece of her pain, and I didn't know what to do with it. All the longing and confusion I'd felt over the past months solidified into a single, overwhelming emotion, a fierce, protective wave of empathy. I wanted to tell her that I understood, that I saw the cage, that I saw her, not just the perfect woman in the perfect house. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just said, "My dad used to say a house is just a box until you fill it with a life you love." Her eyes met mine, and this time, the look in them was completely unguarded. It was a look of profound, aching loneliness, a look that said she knew exactly what I meant. "Your dad sounds like a wise man," she whispered. The rain began to let up, the drumming softening to a gentle patter. The spell was breaking. I knew I should leave, that I had already stayed too long, crossed too many lines. "I should go," I said, placing my empty mug in the sink. The rain stopping, she didn't try to stop me. She just nodded, her expression once again shuttered and distant. She walked me to the side door, the silence between us heavier than before. "Thank you for the tea, Eleanor," I said, using her first name for the first time. It felt both terrifying and right. She looked at me, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Be safe driving home, Maya," she said, and her use of my name was just as significant. As I walked to my beat-up truck, the air fresh and clean after the rain, I knew everything had changed. She had let me see inside the cage. And I had a terrible, wonderful feeling that I was going to want to find a way to open the door. After the day of the storm, the silence between us became different. It was no longer a void but a vessel, filled with everything we hadn't said in her kitchen. The polite nods were replaced by lingering glances. I'd feel her eyes on me as I worked, and when I'd look up, she would hold my gaze for a moment before diving into the water. Her swimming seemed different, too. Less like an escape and more like a meditation. Slower, more graceful. Or maybe I was just projecting. Maybe I was the one who had changed. I started doing something small, something foolish. My route to her house took me past a nursery with the most beautiful gardenias. The scent was intoxicating. On a whim, I bought a small plant. The next Tuesday, before I left, I plucked a single, perfect white blossom and left it floating in the pool skimmer basket, where I knew she'd find it when she cleaned it out. It was an anonymous gesture, a secret message. It was a way of leaving a piece of myself behind, of saying I was here, I see you, without having to speak the words. I did it again the next week, and the week after that. A silent, weekly offering. I had no idea if she even noticed, or if she did, what she thought. Maybe she just assumed it had blown in from a neighbor's yard. But it felt important. It was my way of adding something imperfect and alive to her sterile, perfect world. One Tuesday in late August, the air already holding the first, faint hint of autumn, I was packing up my equipment when she walked out onto the patio. She wasn't in her bikini, but in a simple linen dress. In her hand, she was holding the week's gardenia. My heart stopped. "I believe this is yours," she said, her voice soft. There was no escaping it. My face burned, but I met her eyes. "I just thought it was pretty," I mumbled, my excuse sounding flimsy even to my own ears. She walked closer, stopping just a foot in front of me. The scent of the flower mingled with her own subtle perfume. It was dizzying. "They're my favorite," she said, her eyes searching mine. My grandmother had a gardenia bush by her front door. The scent always reminds me of being safe. She looked down at the flower in her hand, turning it over in her fingers. I haven't felt safe in a very long time, the confession laid me bare. This wasn't about a flower anymore. It was about everything that had been building between us, week by week, glance by glance. The air grew thick, charged with a tension that was almost unbearable. "Eleanor," I started, though I had no idea what I was going to say. "Why, Maya?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She looked up from the flower, her gaze intense, pleading. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" I asked, my voice just as quiet. "Making me feel." She trailed off, shaking her head as if frustrated with her own inability to find the words. "Making this place feel less empty." Making me feel less empty, I couldn't breathe. This was it. The moment where everything could fall apart or finally come together. All the fear, all the professionalism, all the reasons why this was a terrible idea, they all evaporated under the heat of her gaze. All that was left was the truth. "Because when I look at you," I said, my voice trembling, "I don't see an empty house. I just see you." A tear escaped her eye and traced a slow path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Slowly, as if testing the air, she lifted her free hand and cupped my face, her thumb stroking my cheekbone. Her touch was featherlight, but it grounded me, sent a tremor through my entire body. It wasn't a prelude to a kiss. It was something more profound. It was a question, an acceptance, a surrender. "This is complicated," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know," I whispered back, leaning into her touch. Her thumb brushed against my lips, and my eyes fluttered shut. The world narrowed to this single point of contact, to the scent of gardenias and the impossible, undeniable truth of her touch. I had spent months on the edge of this woman's world, and now, somehow, I had been invited in. The cage door was open, and I was walking through it, terrified and exhilarated and utterly, completely lost in